Chapter 25 of The American. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The American by Henry James. Chapter 25. Newman called upon the comical Duchess and found her at home. An old gentleman with a high nose and a gold-headed cane was just taking leave of her. He made Newman a protracted obeisance as he retired, and our hero supposed that he was one of the mysterious grandees with whom he had shaken hands at Madame de Bellegarde's ball. The Duchess, in her armchair, from which she did not move, with a great flower-pot on one side of her, a pile of pink-covered novels on the other, and a large piece of tapestry depending from her lap, presented an expansive and imposing front, but her aspect was in the highest degree gracious, and there was nothing in her manner to check the effusion of his confidence. She talked to him about flowers and books, getting launched with marvelous promptitude, about the theatres, about the peculiar institutions of his native country, about the humidity of Paris, about the pretty complexions of the American ladies, about his impressions of France and his opinion of its female inhabitants. All this was a brilliant monologue on the part of the Duchess, who, like many of her countrywomen, was a person of an affirmative rather than an interrogative cast of mind, who made mots and put them herself into circulation, and who was apt to offer you a present of a convenient little opinion neatly enveloped in the gilt paper of a happy Gallicism. Newman had come to her with a grievance, but he found himself in an atmosphere in which apparently no cognizance was taken of grievance, an atmosphere into which the chill of discomfort had never penetrated, and which seemed exclusively made up of mild, sweet, stale intellectual perfumes. The feeling with which he had watched Madame d'Outreville at the treacherous festival of the Bellegardes came back to him. She struck him as a wonderful old lady in a comedy, particularly well up in her part. He observed before long that she asked him no questions about their common friends, she made no allusion to the circumstances under which he had been presented to her. She neither feigned ignorance of a change in these circumstances, nor pretended to condole with him upon it. But she smiled and discoursed and compared the tender-tinted wools of her tapestry, as if the Bellegardes and their wickedness were not of this world. "She is fighting shy," said Newman to himself, and having made the observation he was prompted to observe, farther, how the Duchess would carry off her indifference. She did so in a masterly manner. There was not a gleam of disguised consciousness in those small, clear, demonstrative eyes, which constituted her nearest claim to personal loveliness. There was not a symptom of apprehension that Newman would trench upon the ground she proposed to avoid. "Upon my word, she does it very well," he tacitly commented. "They all hold together bravely, and whether any one else can trust them or not, they can certainly trust each other." Newman, at this juncture, fell to admiring the Duchess for her fine manners. He felt, most accurately, that she was not a grain less urbane than she would have been if his marriage was still in prospect, but he felt also that she was not a particle more urbane. He had come, so reasoned the Duchess. Heaven knew why he had come, after what had happened, and for the half hour, therefore, she would be charmante. But she would never see him again. Finding no ready-made opportunity to tell his story, Newman pondered these things more dispassionately than might have been expected. He stretched his legs as usual, and even chuckled a little, appreciatively and noiselessly. And then, as the Duchess went on relating a mot with which her mother had snubbed the great Napoleon, it occurred to Newman that her evasion of a chapter of French history more interesting to himself might possibly be the result of an extreme consideration for his feelings. Perhaps it was delicacy on the Duchess's part, not policy. He was on the point of saying something himself, to make the chance which he had determined to give her still better, when the servant announced another visitor. The Duchess, on hearing the name—it was that of an Italian prince—gave a little imperceptible pout, and said to Newman rapidly, "I beg you to remain. I desire this visit to be short." Newman said to himself, at this, that Madame d'Outreville intended, after all, that they should discuss the Bellegardes together. The prince was a short stout man with a head disproportionately large. He had a dusky complexion and a bushy eyebrow, beneath which his eye wore a fixed and somewhat defiant expression. He seemed to be challenging you to insinuate that he was top heavy. The Duchess, judging from her charge to Newman, regarded him as a bore, but this was not apparent from the unchecked flow of her conversation. She made a fresh series of mots, characterized with great felicity the Italian intellect and the taste of the figs at Sorrento, predicted the ultimate future of the Italian kingdom, disgust with the brutal Sardinian rule and complete reversion throughout the peninsula to the sacred sway of the Holy Father, and finally gave a history of the love affairs of the Princess X. This narrative provoked some rectifications on the part of the prince, who, as he said, pretended to know something about that matter, and having satisfied himself that Newman was in no laughing mood, either with regard to the size of his head or anything else, he entered into the controversy with an animation for which the Duchess, when she set him down as a bore, could not have been prepared. The sentimental vicissitudes of the Princess X led to a discussion of the heart history of Florentine nobility in general. The Duchess had spent 5 weeks in Florence and had gathered much information on the subject. This was merged, in turn, in an examination of the Italian heart per se. The Duchess took a brilliantly heterodox view, thought it the least susceptible organ of its kind that she had ever encountered, related examples of its want of susceptibility, and at last declared that for her the Italians were a people of ice. The prince became flame to refute her, and his visit really proved charming. Newman was naturally out of the conversation. He sat with his head a little on one side, watching the interlocutors. The Duchess, as she talked, frequently looked at him with a smile, as if to intimate, in the charming manner of her nation, that it lay only with him to say something very much to the point. But he said nothing at all, and at last his thoughts began to wander. A singular feeling came over him, a sudden sense of the folly of his errand. What under the sun had he to say to the Duchess, after all? Wherein would it profit him to tell her that the Bellegardes were traitors, and that the old lady, into the bargain, was a murderess? He seemed morally to have turned a sort of somersault, and to find things looking differently in consequence. He felt a sudden stiffening of his will and quickening of his reserve. What in the world had he been thinking of when he fancied the Duchess could help him, and that it would conduce to his comfort to make her think ill of the Bellegardes? What did her opinion of the Bellegardes matter to him? It was only a shade more important than the opinion the Bellegardes entertained of her. The Duchess help him? That cold, stout, soft, artificial woman help him? She who in the last 20 minutes had built up between them a wall of polite conversation in which she evidently flattered herself that he would never find a gate. Had it come to that he was asking favors of conceited people, and appealing for sympathy where he had no sympathy to give? He rested his arms on his knees, and sat for some minutes staring into his hat. As he did so, his ears tingled. He had come very near being an ass. Whether or no the Duchess would hear his story, he wouldn't tell it. Was he to sit there another half hour for the sake of exposing the Bellegardes? The Bellegardes be hanged! He got up abruptly and advanced to shake hands with his hostess. "You can't stay longer?" she asked very graciously. "I am afraid not," he said. She hesitated a moment, and then, "I had an idea you had something particular to say to me," she declared. Newman looked at her; he felt a little dizzy. For the moment he seemed to be turning his somersault again. The little Italian prince came to his help. "Ah, madam, who has not that?" he softly sighed. "Don't teach Mr. Newman to say fadaises," said the Duchess. "It is his merit that he doesn't know how." "Yes, I don't know how to say fadaises," said Newman, "and I don't want to say anything unpleasant." "I am sure you are very considerate," said the Duchess with a smile, and she gave him a little nod for good-bye with which he took his departure. Once in the street, he stood for some time on the pavement, wondering whether, after all, he was not an ass not to have discharged